Welcome to Think Orphan, the podcast for orphan excellence. Real talk with real people navigating the global orphan crisis.
Welcome back to the Think Orphan podcast. Thanks again for being a part of the conversation. Today, we have another really good conversation between a lot of different people. It's not just Brandon and I interviewing one person. We have some great folks. I'm going to let Brandon introduce what we're talking about and who these people are in a minute. But as most of you know, but some of you may be new to the show, I'm Phil Dark, your host. Brandon Stiver, who I've mentioned already, is my co-host, my brother. We get to do this together and have great conversations that we love when you engage with us to be able to be thinking deeply about these really, really important issues that help us to, as we understand these issues better, we can love orphaned, vulnerable children, families better and better every day. So, Brandon, what do we got going on today, man?
Yeah, well, thanks, Phil. I mean, we're getting into another one of our conversations episodes. And, in this particular episode, our audience, we've talked about care reform. We've talked about, the importance of prioritizing family in terms of, how do we care for orphan and vulnerable children? Well, the best way is hopefully to not allow them to continue in their orphanhood. And that looks like getting them into family. But there's a whole infrastructure, as we're well aware, and as we'll even discuss today. There's a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure around the care and protection of children in the global South. And what we're going to get into today is what does it look like to work within those existing structures to bring transformation. So we're going to be talking about, supporting transition. And we have a few professionals working in various capacities with a few different organizations and contexts represented. So on the show today, a couple returners and one new. So Elli Oswald from Faith to Action is here with us. Jonathan Dowell from 1 Million Homes / Weza Care Solutions, and Hannah Wan from ACCI. So we're going to get into a great conversation with these guests. And, as I was kind of thinking through the different conversations that we wanted to have and introducing this format, obviously, being a staff member at 1 Million Home, this is really kind of core to how we operate. We really want to see kids get into family, but we know that those things don't just happen overnight. There is a transition period. There's a lot of people that it involves, a lot of various stakeholders, and then all the way down to the child and family level. So this was definitely a conversation that I wanted to have. And, there's different people that are operating in this space. So really quick, I'm just going to kind of open up with coming to each different person. And if you could just introduce yourselves and really kind of share, what brought you into working in this space of supporting transition. So Elli, I'll come to you first.
No, great. Well, it's so good to be here with you guys, and especially with Hannah and Jonathan, who have incredible practical experience. I'm probably the ivory tower one of the room. I'm with Faith to Action, and Faith to Action is really focused on helping Christians access and then utilize best practices when it comes for caring for orphaned and vulnerable children around the world. So we provide free educational resources and services to help other people do their very best for children. And we've been doing this for 17 years. And as we go on with our work of helping people understand the importance of family for every child, whether that's biological family, relatives, foster care, adoptive family, as we're raising awareness, we always run across people who are deeply involved in running residential care, whether they're significant funders, founders of an orphanage, and they want to make this shift. And so that's where we've had to be responsive and say, we're going to journey with you to get access to the technical support you need to do that good work. You said it in your intro, but this change is not easy. And it's really important that we get it right, or else it could be the children that suffer. So we're doing all we can do to help those people connect with the resources and the support that they need to transition really well.
That's good. Thanks, Elli. And Phil and I will take no offense that you said you were especially glad to be on with Hannah and Jonathan.
I took offense.
Okay, sorry. And I will take offense.
So, yeah, I did, but that's okay.
Well, this is such old hat for Elli. She even contributed to our 200th episode, which was so sweet of her. So I take no offense. Phil can speak for himself.
Listener. So,
Thank you.
support.
Oh, we got a listener on the show today. Thanks, Elli.
I just took it as you'd heard so much from us that, it's just you're sick of it. So, but
She's sick of you, Phil, not me. All right.
I'm just kidding, obviously, just to make sure people know I'm just joking, because sometimes that does not come across on the air. So,
okay. There you go. There we go. All right. Hannah, why don't you introduce yourselves to our audience and how God brought you into this space?
Sure. Thanks for that. And thanks for having me on. I've actually never even listened to a podcast before, if you'll believe it. So you have somehow roped me into this. But yeah, I'm Hannah from ACCI, and that's Australian Christian Churches International Relief. And full disclosure, I came into this space as an orphanage director. I'm very open about that because it's where I kind of cut my teeth and discovered firsthand just how hard transition is. Because at the time we were doing this back in 2011, there really weren't very many guidelines. There weren't people doing it. You almost had to kind of whisper about it. People were scared to talk about it. And so we were really lost and kind of just groping our way in the darkness to how you figure this out. And we didn't even know what we were doing, honestly. It all started because we decided that we wanted to reconnect children with their families for the purpose of them having a support network when they actually aged out of care. So it wasn't ever meant to be transition because most of the kids in our care actually were true orphans. But as we soon discovered, they did, of course, have families. And so as we started to connect them and we had families come and visit, we would take the kids to visit. They would do phone calls. Very organically, some of the parents and kids started to come to us and say, hey, could we actually maybe live together? And so that's how it started. And I had no idea what I was doing. Like I said, in country, there really weren't very many resources. And so I had to reach outwards to clinical social workers and people who had done EDI in other settings to try and figure out our way. And so it was really out of that experience where I thought, there must be other institutions that are wanting this kind of help, and at least I can share what we did wrong and our mistakes and what did work. And so that's really how I got started in that space in Cambodia, and then I did start working in some of the other countries around Cambodia as well, and came into contact with ACCI at that point. So I'm, still learning. There's still a lot to learn about, and still a lot of mistakes that we're making. But I feels like we're getting there, right? And it feels like there's more structure. It feels like there's a carved out space that we have. So very happy to be here as part of that.
That's good. Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for joining the show. A regular listener and a never listened to it before. It's always good to have a mix. So thanks so much for coming on and agreeing to come onto this show. We really look forward to learning from you. And I'll just say you're also in good company. I used to work at an orphanage in Tanzania. I think pretty much all of us in some regard have kind of come from either that mindset or that practice. And that's why we are also the ones that are most passionate about walking alongside, those organizations that are in good faith, trying their best to serve orphan and vulnerable children. But we do want to see, progress. So thanks so much. Jonathan, I won't ask whether or not you ever listen to the show because you're a close colleague, and I would take that too personally. But nonetheless, Jonathan, maybe just reintroduce yourself to our audience and yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. It is a pleasure to be on the show with you guys and among a good company of experience and knowledge. And so my name is Jonathan. I'm work for One Main Home and our venture in Kenya called Weza Care Solutions. God brought me into this really just about 10 years ago when I came to Kenya. I actually didn't have any education in this space or experience in this space. I was a business guy, IT and project management, process stuff, just corporate. The corporate world. And my wife and I answered the call to just kind of quit everything, quit our jobs, quit our careers, and come to Kenya to be missionaries and serve, however God led. And in doing so, we started off with some child sponsorship programs and found our ways to an organization called Agape Children's Ministry that was doing really post-transition. They had recently transitioned their model and were still kind of working out the kinks. And so I actually never worked directly in an orphanage setting, but I spent the last decade doing post-transition support and seeing what really could happen to an organization when they adopted that family-based approach. And I think that's really where I got passionate about this, because we got to see firsthand the staff's kind of realization of the power of family, and the better outcomes that they were seeing, the challenges they went through the transition, but then like the bigger outcomes and the better results that they were starting to see. And so a lot of my staff went through the transition themselves, and where they say the same things, or said the same things that everybody says when they go through transition. And so it was really a great opportunity to see not only what does transition look like, but if you take transition and you spend the next decade kind of living with that transition, what is it you can accomplish? And it's huge. And it's made me realize there's no better place for a kid to grow up than a safe, healthy family. Obviously, we want kids to be in a safe place, and that's not always the case, which is why there's a need for organizations and need for support and child welfare services. But it is where my faith in family really kind of was realized. And when we realized, we'd been doing it for 10 years, but we're still seeing the same problems, we realized we can't do this alone. That one organization by itself, heads down, just trying to do the work, is not enough to change the system. And so that's when we partnered with One Main Home and started up this venture called Weza in Kenya, which is just focused purely on doing transition support for organizations, and being able to see other organizations now going through the same kind of struggles and questions is encouraging and exciting, and also it's challenging because each and every kid's case is unique, and each and every family is a struggle that has to be fought for. And so there's no easy answers, but there's hope that there's a way forward in this, and that kids can grow up in safe and loving families. That's a powerful hope to have and carry.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Jonathan. So as we are talking about transition support services, talking about coming alongside organizations, right? If we just say, okay, here's an orphanage, a residential care facility, and here's something that's family, community-based type of service, there is a process, to go from point A to point B. So that process can look like various things. There's no monolith in terms of all family-based care looks like this uniform, type of service. It can look like any number of things. And we've seen a lot of variance in terms of what people transition to become. Orphanages are also not a monolith, but they, at least from a services standpoint, are a bit more uniform than what we might see them transition to, right? So, I mean, right off the bat, some of the people that have been on the show before, we can think of Global Child Advocates, more in Southeast Asia, where ACCI has done a lot of work. They transition and start doing more foster care, or they set up social enterprise, or they do early education. We can think about Cherish Uganda. We just had, Brent on the show not too long ago. They transition and they really double down in healthcare services. They also do education services, but it's more vocational leaning. So there's any number of things that organizations might transition to, but they are going to rely on, typically, hopefully, rely on other people that have been down this path before. So I think it'll be helpful if we do start with some definitions, some understandings. And I'm going to come to Elli first, because a few years ago in 2020, Faith to Action conducted the Transition Support Services Survey. We will link it in the show notes. We're going to have a lot of links in the show notes for people that want to follow up. But this survey, really kind of took a pulse and developed some understanding of what it is that we're even looking at precisely. Elli, can you just kind of overview that survey and kind of help us understand what it is that we're discussing, and even who are the people that are kind of engaging within this transition support space?
Sure. Yeah, I think, this is an exciting time. Faith to Action's been around 17-ish years. And the people we're working with now are recognizing the last 5 years, we're really seeing an acceleration of change. Countries around the world, systems of protection and care are in reform, which is incredibly exciting and also a bit scary. And so, we're seeing commitments from governments to family-based care, non-governmental organizations, like maybe some of the listeners here today. We're seeing donors starting to have a different requirement. We're seeing advocates really pushing this work internationally, domestically. So it's an exciting time. But until recently, as Hannah kind of alluded to, there's been limited understanding of what support is actually needed to help an organization move from a focus on residential care towards family-based and community-based services to support children. And then also a limited understanding of what support exists and where it exists for organizations that are trying to do this important work of transitioning. So we know that organizations need help, but it's really the question we were looking at is, so who can help them? Who can most appropriately help them? So this study, again, was a few years ago, so a lot of progress has been made since then, but it tried to bring light to existing organizations and individuals who are providing or could have potential to provide assistance on the ground to organizations in transition. Specifically, those who could provide things like individualized coaching to an organization, specific technical support around social work, and all of the other areas where there's technical needs in transition. So we went as far and wide as we could, and we knew that was still limited, asking everyone we could to share it with everyone they could, and really looking at what services an organization or an individual provides, where they're working, and some other really important questions. So just a few quick kind of findings that came from that study. Excitingly, of our respondents, they had supported more than 1,500 transitions of residential care across 61 different countries. So there is a significant level of experience that exists. And again, this survey is not going to be comprehensive. That's not possible. There's pockets of knowledge that we'll never be able to access at one point, but we're trying to get as much as we can. So that was exciting to kind of reaffirm that experience exists. But also, almost half of the respondents reported that they lacked resources and capacity to support a whole transition process. So of those people that have been doing them, at least half of them were humble enough to go, and I'm not sure we're as well equipped as we could be to be supporting those transitions. So that was pretty important kind of finding. So with we say 5.4 million children, but we know it's a lot more than that children who are currently in residential care. And then this increased pressure that we're seeing for children to be reunified with their families and placed in family-based care. What we're imagining, and I think we're also experiencing, is a shortage of organizations and individuals that can actually provide support services to transitioning residential care centers. So it really highlighted the need to build the capacity and increase the accessibility to transitioning support service providers, if I can use that term, which we simply made up for this survey. We're all using different terms, so that might be a term we can clarify. Let's just clarify today.
Yeah. It's the industry term now. So keep going, Elli. You're a trendsetter.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, what I'm really excited to say is in the 3 years since that work, there has been a real increase in emphasis on collaborating around this issue of needing to increase capacity and access to support for organizations who are transitioning. We can talk more about that, but it really put a spotlight on the challenge that we have of ensuring that as these transitions are catalyzed, we need to be able to help people figure out how to do that really well.
Yeah, and I think there's so much, obviously, there's so much there. We could talk about so many different things, but I just want to kind of take a step back right now. And we're making assumptions that there are organizations that want to transition and that are thinking about transitioning, that have this desire to transition. So what are you seeing? And this is really as an open question. I did probably want to start with Hannah or Jonathan, since Elli just shared a bit. But what are some of the main reasons you are seeing in the field, especially why organizations are deciding to undertake a transition to family care?
I can tackle that one. It's all, just guesses, right? Nobody's really done any formal research on any of this, so it's pretty anecdotal. But there's just so much momentum globally that we're seeing. So Elli already talked about, all the action and stronger stances that national governments are taking. And I think that's obviously putting a lot of pressure on the institutions themselves to comply. But then, of course, we're also seeing so much pressure on the donors. So from the donor and sending countries, whether that's funding to orphanages or for volunteers or tourists to orphanages, a lot of that is coming into a regulatory framework. And so I think that's all increasing the overall awareness, not only of institutions and donors, that this is a change that's probably inevitable. And that really, has been a huge shift since, 10 years ago, where, like I said, we had to be really careful about that. And so I feel like what that translates to is this overall awareness of institutions and directors that somehow they have to justify their existence. I don't know if you've found that in your practice, but you go to visit any odd one as part of your work, and they know that they have to tell you that they have a child protection policy in place, even if it might just be a piece of paper that nobody ever sees. Or they talk about family reintegration, but what they actually mean is, we just kick out the kids that we don't like. So there is certainly a level or a kind of group of institutions that have that awareness, but are still, not actually following through with practice, which is a big change from, like I said, 10 years ago, where, you didn't have to talk about those things and everybody felt like they were well within their right to run an institution.
Hey guys, I wanted to pop in really quick to personally invite you to join me, Phil, and scores of other orphan care leaders at CAFO 2023. The summit is September 20th through 22nd in Oklahoma City and is hosted by the Christian Alliance for Orphans, an alliance of more than 250 respected organizations and a global network of churches committing to helping every child experience God's unfailing love in a thriving family. CAFO 2023 is an unforgettable gathering of more than 2,000 Christian leaders, parents, and practitioners coming together from over 50 countries to worship and learn from best-in-class speakers and leaders. Speakers include author Katie Davis Majors and Bible expositor Dr. Mamusha Fenta, as well as past Think Orphan guests like psychiatrist Kurt Thompson and CAFO president Jed Medifin. There will also be music and worship with special guests Shane and worship leaders Awadi Moro. Wow, that is such a lineup. If you are currently serving in or interested in learning more about foster care and adoption, best practices in global orphan care, Christian nonprofit leadership, or church-based ministry, you don't want to miss the wisdom, truth, and guidance at this event. Learn more and register today at cafo2023.org or just click the link in our show notes. Prices go up August 31st, so don't wait. I hope to see you in OKC.
I think one of the things that I've seen that has been a main reason for transition, because I think there's different cases. There's external pressures, like you're talking about, donor pressure, cultural pressure, laws and legal frameworks changing, and all those things are nice and good. But my favorite transitions is when I find organizations that transitioned without those pressures, because they're free to look at outcomes and say, wait a minute, why is this not working? Organizations that wonder and that question, and they look at their data or they look at their results and they say, how can we do this better? And those are the organizations that I think I really wish and hope that everyone makes the transition because of those questions, because those are the questions that I think, unfortunately, so many organizations don't have the luxury to ask. Either donor pressures are saying you have to do this, or expectations that you have to do it this way or that way. But we're not free enough as institutions, organizations, to necessarily look at our outcomes and really be free to make changes to our operating model to make those outcomes better. And so even though it's probably the least amount of reason why people transition, I think that's the reason why we should transition, because next year, the year after, more research comes out, 10 years from now, new trends come out. We should be always on this kind of path of discovery, and transition is particularly with care reform, is a now problem and a now transition. But in 10 years, it's going to happen again, and there's going to be new learning and growing, and systems are going to keep changing. And so my favorite is when an organization changes because they have the freedom to look at outcomes and pursue better results by testing and adopting new models. And to me is my favorite, because there's so much hope in there, because they're looking for the best interest of kids and families.
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
absolutely.
I agree with that, because you often see the best case scenarios where you have a director who's taken a step back and said, well, if these kids are going to visit their families during the summer, then why do they have to stay here all the time?
Right.
Or, you get a social worker who comes in, he's hired and he's saying, well, I'm doing all these assessments on families. Why am I not looking at whether they can resume care of their children? And that's such an organic agent for change. And like you said, those are the absolute, nicest ones to work with. And then I think on the other hand, the reality of the world, unfortunately, is a lot of institutions are run by people who don't have that kind of drive. They're not necessarily motivated altruistically. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who don't have the best interests of kids in mind are in those positions of power. So I think, we've got our favorite ones and the ones that we love to track. And then we also have the reality of the remaining 75%, where it's like, well, those kids are still in care. Those kids are still at harm. And even if we have to force it somehow, we've still got to do that work. And I think that's kind of the new space that's opening up. Whereas a few years ago, it was really those early adopters and those innovators and people who really wanted to see that change because they'd experienced what was wrong with it, versus what we're, primarily dealing with now, which is how do you deal with those people that, shouldn't be in those positions?
Yeah.
I know. Just add that we are often working with organizations who have a significant donor side or headquarters in the United States, and more often than not, we see a crisis has pushed them towards full transition. I think, things like a child protection issue coming up where they find, that there's things that they weren't aware of or that were hushed. Same with financial corruption and lack of trust lost with their leader on the ground. And then kind of more towards what Jonathan was talking about, sometimes you just kind of see just a general discouragement when a generation ages out and they're not doing as well as young adults. And if they have that freedom to be able to and the commitment to pursue excellence, they will start to question what they're doing and not kind of put it off as with excuses. But I think, yes, national pressure is effectively pushing people. I think, yes, our awareness raising efforts with the faith-based audience, most Christians, when they find out that there's a better way to do it, they want to do it that way. But the reality is, too, I think this transition space really highlights challenges within organizations. And when those things rise up, they start to go, what are we doing? And are we doing it well? So those crises are terrible, but also can be a catalyst for change.
Yeah, and I just kind of, to tie it together, I love what you talked about, Jonathan, as far as the best is when the organizations are the ones that are coming up with the ideas and dreaming about different solutions and within the best practices, because otherwise I think we're putting ourselves at the mercy of other people who, I think I can't remember whether it was Hannah or Ellie talking about the fact that those other people don't necessarily have the best interests of the children in mind, nor might they might not even know what those best interests are. And so the people that are closest to the ground are the ones who are going to know the best solutions for those particular children. And so to the extent we can get ahead of the curve and start these conversations before the governments get in, before donors get in, before other people come in and say, no, this is how we have to do it. Because what I'm seeing in several different countries is governments are taking the lead and they're making these different changes and requiring changes that may not make sense in practice at all in particular instances. But they're coming up with these black and white, here it is, here's the answer, we're going to go this direction, and they're ignoring the nuances because they just can't do it at that level. They can't deal with the nuances. But if we can on the ground say these are the best practice, these are the things that we need to be able to have, and there are nuances and there is some gray area in some of these things, that's going to be the best solutions will come out of that.
Yeah. And I think you've probably heard me talk about this before, but we can see kind of government pressure catalyze a Christian response push against care reform. And we do see that. To be honest, we see it in some of the countries that are making the best progress. And I'm not saying that the government is always right in the way that they're implementing, but I think what you're highlighting, Phil, is that we can get ahead of that. We don't need to get caught up in that. Like, let's just focus on the best interest of children, what we're called to do in that space, and really move to a space of leadership in care reform. And
Exactly.
I always talk about this train that's headed down the tracks. Like, the train is moving. We're not going to stop it, guys. So where are we going to be on that train? Are we going to be drugged behind, and the caboose kind of screeching on with our brakes? Or could we actually be the headlight of that train, shining the vision that we have in Scripture for family and the decades and decades of love and support that the church has provided children around the world?
Yeah.
And that's where I want to be. And I really think that's part of the work we can do on this podcast, is to encourage people to come along and be leaders in this space.
Right. Yeah. Well, no, that's really good, Ellie. And I feel as though what we're getting into is really what we would say is kind of like one of the first steps in terms of transitioning and reforming care, which is shifting the mindset, right? How do we actually engage with people to rethink their practices? And it is hard to change people's thoughts. It's hard to change people's behavior. Sometimes we just naturally get entrenched into the things that we know. And sometimes when it's the thing that we know is running a children's home, then it's easy to just try to maintain that thing rather than rethinking like, oh, what if I'm actually not doing this the best way possible? What if there's another way to go about this? And I think that that's really critical. And one of the other things, going back to kind of some of those external causes, is around, of course, we're familiar with the UN General Assembly and their resolution in 2019. Jonathan, will come to you in a few minutes in terms of like Kenya and some of the kind of big governmental changes in certain countries. We've seen this in Rwanda. We've seen this in El Salvador. Sometimes the government steps in a way that promotes, reunification or promotes transitioning the services that are provided, but sometimes it can be heavy-handed, or what you see even more often is that the government is not being proactive enough to actually promote family care. And I think that that's going to be the majority of countries. Hannah, I would love to kind of come to you. You mentioned 2011, for you having run an orphanage and then, working at ACCI thereafter, you guys were really among some of those early adopters of, international NGOs advocating for care reform, even leading change on the ground, especially, I believe, in Southeast Asia, although you guys have programs elsewhere too. What were some of those lessons that ACCI learned in those early days as you guys were coming alongside other organizations?
So maybe to just start with a little bit of background on how ACCI came into this space, because it's different from my story. So ACCI really came in as a donor. So through their affiliation with the ACC Church, they were, in essence, donors to institutions all over the world. And so when there was transition taking place within ACCI to work towards family-based care and to stop funding institutions, then they came in as the donor partner to institutions around the world to say, hey, you basically, need to transition. And so there was that absolute you have to recognize the power and the influence in that, as much as it was a participatory process. And so I think that was their experience, whereas my experience coming in was really on the director-led side, because I was working with directors in country. I was a director myself. And so I think the biggest lesson probably in bringing those two different vantage points together was when I started working with ACCI as a consultant on their Myanmar project, and Rebecca and Nip at the time and I were saying, well, this is going to be kind of an experiment, because we've never had to work with donors where we're not the donor. We've never had to work with directors where we're not the director. So we didn't have that control. We didn't have that power and influence. And so we really learned a lot during that project in Myanmar, and it's still going. And now they're registered as a local organization and doing some really good work. But we learned a lot about donor engagement and how to walk alongside donors who wanted to see that change but didn't necessarily know how to do it. And a lot of cases where they assumed that it was going to be pretty straightforward, and lots of challenges came up, and things got pretty ugly in some of the cases. And so it became a question of, well, how do we actually keep the donors engaged? We don't have external funding or pots and pots of it to rely on. If a donor decides that halfway through, I'm really upset that, this director has been lying to me for the past 15 years and I can't take it anymore and I'm going to walk away. And as irresponsible as that sounds, it's completely understandable because, they've had this relationship built on trust. It might have been a pastor that they were funding, or, it could be any number of things. And so to have that disillusionment can really cloud the whole process and their involvement in it. And so we were really able to come up with some strategies around how to keep them engaged. We created peer donor groups that had, monthly calls that moved to quarterly calls. In a sense, there were donors that were to different institutions that were kind of keeping each other accountable. So you didn't want to see people just dropping off. You wanted to see that the group was together. And then we also kind of looked at how to approach different stakeholders within transition. So how do you actually talk to directors who don't really care about the best interest of children? How do you talk to directors who are going to potentially lose their income if they agree to transition? How do you talk to donors whose whole identities are built around the fact that they have this orphanage that they run or fund? And so we had to come up with a very varied kind of toolkit around how to tailor that communications, not only around the buy-in, but how do you actually keep them engaged throughout the whole process? So that was a huge learning moment for us.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And what I love about ACCI, and, obviously Rebecca has been on this show in the past, and as you guys learn, you guys write things down. And I feel as though ACCI was really pioneering a lot of some of the early resources in this space. So just really appreciate that. Jonathan, I want to come to you, and just kind of looking at the experience of Weza Care Solutions in Kenya, and kind of talking about the advocacy or the government reform, with the children's law that came out last year. It really has kind of shifted what it looks like for care and protection around kids in Kenya. And it's kind of created this moment where I think a lot of people within care reform, or even orphan care more broadly, are kind of looking at Kenya right now to kind of see what is this next case study in terms of care reform. So maybe Jonathan, just kind of speak maybe to, what with Kenya being a country that is really promoting family care at the government policy and implementation level, how does that enable your work? What is that environment like?
Well, it's definitely changed. So we started doing this before care reform was cemented in law with the New Children Act, before the national strategy came out. And in fact, we actually didn't start this work for the purpose of transition. We actually started supporting organizations because we believed that reintegration was the way to go, and especially when it came to street children. And so our whole goal was actually to just focus on, street children organizations and teaching them how to do reintegration as a model to increase the number of kids that were going home on a regular basis. So reintegration as a service, not reintegration as a response to care reform. And what we realized was, well, they're actually not all that different. A reintegration of children off the streets and reintegration of children out of institutions is largely the same. It's actually somewhat harder in institutional settings than it was with street children. I think the first generation of kids off the streets probably is more difficult than institutional care. But after children have been haven't been on the streets as long because the program's been operating, actually is harder to reintegrate a child out of an institution. At least we found over time. So yeah, we started working with it, and then care reform happened, and we realized, okay, they're one and the same, and we really kind of realigned everything we were doing around care reform and started expanding our focus on looking at reintegrating children out of institutions and transitioning them to prevention models. And I think the way things started in Kenya was very focused on shutdown, on deinstitutionalization, on you shouldn't exist, and so therefore you need to go away, and you need to go away in a way that's safe. Thankfully, the government has really changed their conversation around this, that it's not about shutdown, and that we're not wanting to shut this infrastructure down, but that the government's leading out that transition is the way, that we need these organizations to continue to exist because it is the majority of the child welfare system in Kenya, and it is and it can be used and should be leveraged in the future. And so transitioning to prevention, to family strengthening, to other kinds of services that are going to continue to provide support has been a transition that I think has been really, I've been very excited about, because it was a much harder conversation when the government was trying to shut everyone down and the organizations are trying to survive, it's too much pressure. And they almost lost the infrastructure that, millions of dollars are being poured into from private organizations, largely faith-based organizations running, largely faith-based organizations funding. And all that was going to be gone if we just shut it down. And so thankfully, we've been able to change the conversation. One thing I think that has been a little different, because we've never had the power as a donor to just say, you got to change. We've always come in as an outsider, as a service provider. And when we're providing a service to a customer, to a beneficiary like an orphanage, you can't see them as the bad guys, and I would question, Hannah, I think you've got some wise experience, but 75% of institution directors not looking out for the best interest of children, I think, is probably it'd be a number I'd question a bit. I think what I've experienced
I just threw that out.
Yeah.
Shooting from the hip.
Yeah.
I think, Hannah, the thing that I really love about my job, about what we do, is that there is a lot of faith we can have in these people. It is a blessing to have this infrastructure. These organizations are, if they can be, they are out for the best interest of these kids. And I do think that a lot of the things that they struggle with as directors of organizations that may make them make bad decisions comes down to the pressures of poverty and the lack of support that exists. And so, I still think the transition support services is a little too myopic. We need support services, because the support that we need to provide to these organizations operating in the global South is never going to end. And we don't have all the answers, and they have the answers. They know how. I first thought that these organizations didn't know what family and community-based care was. But I realized when working with these organizations, they know exactly how to help these families. They just haven't been given the freedom of choice to be able to change their program and their model of their own accord. And when someone provides that space for them, they pick better models. And so I think it is definitely a partnership between the donors and the organizations, that we need these local community-based people. We need to believe in them, and we need to power into them and equip them, and we need to support them. We need to support them with the best kind of practices that corporations get in order to make sure that they're operating at the highest degree of, child protection and safety and safeguarding, but at the same time, giving them the opportunity to discover new ways of providing and giving them the freedom of choice instead of, the pressures that they live in right now. So definitely the government has helped a ton. Now all of a sudden everybody wants to talk about transition. But I think the key is balancing that government pressure, which is good, with a grace-based hope, and really valuing these institutions, these directors, and really equipping them to be able to be the leaders in telling the donors the best way for them to care for children and families in their community.
Yeah, well, I think even, Jonathan, in terms of if we look at this across contexts, we're probably going to find and see different things, So in Kenya, it might look like this. In Southeast Asia, it might look different. In a forthcoming episode of Think Orphan, we're going to actually be talking about when Westerners are coming into orphanages primarily and using it as a source of exploitation of children. And this isn't just kind of in the exploitation of we need a place to send our short-term missions trip. Okay, we talked about that kind of stuff with Hunter Farrell not too long ago. We know that that's there, but even stuff that is really more overt. So obviously we know that there's a mixed bag, and that's probably going to vary from one context to the next for sure. But, as we kind of take a pulse of different countries, and different factors, we have a staff here that was working in Rwanda at a care provider, and the Rwanda experience is very different from Kenya, and they're right in the same country. If we just take a pulse on East Africa in general, we'll see Tanzania, where I was, and they have a very laissez-faire, approach to reform of care for children. We could look at Uganda, where they say the right thing, and yet there's all these kind of diverse interests, right, and conflicts of interest within kind of their broader system. So, of course, it's going to vary from one country to the next. I want to come to Hannah and just, maybe even kind of speak to some of the similarities, maybe some of the differences, that you guys have seen in your work at ACCI.
Yeah, so I was just going back to with what Jonathan was saying. I think it's not, correct of me to say, it's whatever the statistic is. But I think the nuance is in where those best interests lie, in kind of the priority of motivations for people. And I think that's where it gets messy. So I would say, yeah, I think probably most people, are not bad people, and they're out to, most of them get started for the right reasons. But it's all the factors that you mentioned, the poverty, the stresses, even Westerners coming in and encouraging handling of money with absolutely no record keeping. It's a ripe environment for that kind of thing, especially if, you've got a very sick uncle who needs that money and you might just access it for the first time, and it becomes a very slippery slope. So I think that's what we're working with. It's not to say that, all these are bad situations, but there are these very tricky and very entangled situations that people end up in. And it's kind of up to us as those technical support practitioners to come out and help them disentangle that stuff and find a way out of it where that's possible. I mean, in other cases, it's kind of too late, but hopefully those are more of the minority, whereas in the other cases, you have all these challenges to work through. And I think what's happened so much in the transition support space with a lot of organizations is there's kind of this assumption that if we come in and just tell people what's best for children, then people will kind of figure it out. They'll work out how to get through it, and they'll come out the other end, which I think, all of us in this room can say that, well, it's really not that simple. And there's a lot of work that we have to do both internationally and on the ground to help those kinds of stakeholders find a way out of where they currently are. And I think, there is a lot more knowledge and awareness around the need for a diversified approach, not just to buy-in, but, to helping people figure out, well, what else could I be doing? So all the post-transition programming that Jonathan talked about, we need all of that stuff desperately. All the money is there. And how do we kind of work out who are the people that should be running those programs, because they have been able to prioritize the best interests of children, where in other cases, the other motivations have unfortunately won out. So I think it's that balance and trying to work out where are you in that spectrum of risk and all that, and then coming up with a transition strategy that's really in accordance with that.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing to this whole conversation too, is, we're talking about things in generalizations, right? Which we tend to, because we have to at the higher levels. But at the same time, we got to be really careful to not put people into a box based on what we've heard, what we assume, what we think is going on at any given place, what we think they think, what we've heard that this organization is doing X, Y, Z, because we've all met people who we've heard stuff about and we're like, oh, wow, you're not doing at all what I've heard you're doing. This is actually some really good work that I thought you were doing this because somebody had said that. And people have different motives to tell why people are doing what they're doing. And so and it's hard because it takes time, it takes energy, it takes actually building relationships. But that's what we have to do if we're going to be doing this, because we're dealing with human lives. So there's no places that are exact same as the other. And so we need to actually build relationships with people, with the organizations, understand who they are, not just assume, oh, their donors are doing X, Y, Z, their board's doing X, Y, Z either. We need to make sure that we understand the full picture as we're going in, which is why this is so hard, is because we're dealing with people. We're dealing with moving, nuanced, evolving organizations. And rather than saying, oh, this is who you are, I know who you are because you're doing that. Well, they may be doing that because 25 reasons that they don't like. And they're trying to move toward that next thing that we 100% agree with. So how can we get to know them, build relationships, meet them where they are, and take them to the next right thing? What does that look like? So anyway, I just wanted to kind of say that from a bigger picture standpoint.
Well, and I think that human component, that you're bringing up, Phil, is really true. And going back to something that Hannah said that I really agree with is that entanglement. I have talked with people that very distinct, sitting in Moshi, Tanzania, where I was, advocating for family care, saying, hey, the church here is sufficient, right, to meet the needs of orphan and vulnerable children. Seeing kids reintegrate and seeing it be successful, with this type of knowledge, talking with somebody that had been in a different a donor, a U.S.-based person that had been operating in another area of the country, and basically could tell me, full eyes, full knowledge, the orphanage that I started there went under. The person that I was working with was not trustworthy, and we don't even know where the kids are now. And just thinking, like, that's a terrible, terrible story. That is child protection issues up the, what do we say?
Wazoo.
Can't say that.
Up the wazoo.
Up the wazoo. Up the wazoo. That's a lot of red flags. And yet here he is saying, but this time it's going to be different, right? And now they're ready to just start a whole new thing. And what is it that's becoming entangled there? I always think of Jonathan Haidt. I know I've mentioned this to at least a couple people on this call, but we are often, our emotions, our intuition, those kind of less rational components of us, that's the elephant that goes wherever it wants. And what we see is that the rider on top of the elephant, this is Jonathan Haidt, this is his analogy, but that elephant's going to go wherever it wants. But the rider on top, which represents the rationale, the actual like thinking part, it's just going to rationalize wherever it went, right? So we do have to kind of disentangle, going back to the word that Hannah used, what are our motivations? And are we willing to kind of rethink how we're going about this? Because we do become, even the people that got into it for the right reasons, and you're talking about a guy here who felt God call him to go run an orphanage in Africa, right? And I actually pursued that. So I really appreciate that. I do kind of want to turn the corner a little bit and get into some kind of lessons learned, some processes and so forth. And I'm going to come, Elli, one of the things that you guys have been doing over the last year, being an organization that really values interagency collaboration and working across the sector, you guys have been doing some of these transition events where people come to learn about transition from various coaches coming from various organizations. What have been some of the lessons that you guys have learned in that space? Can you just kind of tell us about some of the traction that you guys have developed through those engagements?
Yeah. I mean, Faith to Action's been providing coaching, personal coaching for a few years now. And our goal is always to help them connect, because the best support happens as close as possible to the families and the children in the organization on the ground. But even in that personalized coaching, we felt like there were gaps. We didn't feel like it. We were experiencing gaps where organizations would either give up or transition halfway. They would move towards a family style model, or they would, reintegrate children whose families they knew, and then never really rethink the work that they need to do to trace and engage with the other families of the children there. So it's been a challenge and a struggle. So one of the things we wanted to try was to bring people together in something we call a transition connection event. And it's really about connecting, an organization to a coach. Like I was saying, we think coaching is really important, but it's also connecting them to one another, to other organizations in their same situation, and also connecting them to a larger community, helping them build this sense that you are not alone in this work, that this is actually a movement, that there is a supportive community that you can feel supported by and connected to. We bring together a small group of organizations who are all in similar places early in their transition process. And then we bring along a corresponding group of people with experience in transition. We call them champions. And these are people who have done work in their context, hopefully as close to the context of the organizations that are actually participating as well. And then we spend 3 days just being together. So we cover topics like, getting internal buy-in, engaging stakeholders, building capacity of your staff, family tracing, we give you just kind of introduction to some of the more detailed work, social work around family and child preparation and placement and monitoring. Yes, so there's content, but every time we've done it, the content has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter, because what's really helpful is the dialogue. The opportunity for people to engage with the content, to think through it with other people in a safe space. So they have a chance to talk to one another, to other organizations, to these coaches who really can ask very specific questions too. And then we journey with them for the long term, ensuring that, they are getting the support that they feel like they need and that we might feel like they need as well moving forward, and really trying to get that connections on the ground so that they have solid support for reintegration of children and moving to models of family-based care. So we did just complete a pilot phase in the spring, and we're opening it up to the public now. So you might see some promotion of that. Anybody can nominate an organization. We'd love to, put the link somewhere in your profile. There are other supports. There are other things like this that exist. So what we want to do is be very intentional about learning and sharing that learning, so that Faith to Action would like to get out of the business of supporting transitions. We want to empower and support other people to do that work. That's why we focus on these champions. And that's why after a certain period, we're going to release all of our findings, and we're continually sharing. So just a couple of things from the findings. We have a steering committee that gives input into this. We get feedback from our champions. We're constantly sharing and trying to learn. So one of the things is how important the relational work is. Developing trusting relationships, supporting people through something that is very emotional and a challenging place, especially as leaders of an organization. This is something that I've started to hear people to call accompaniment, and how vital it is to ensure that people feel accompanied and supported and journeyed with. I used to say a few years ago, it's hand holding, and that sounded a little bit like
you're walking your 4-year-old across the street.
But it's a hard journey. And I think the second piece to that too is the need to support organizational change and organizational health. So much of the challenges that organizations face as they're moving into transition are kind of issues that are throughout their organization, and it's an organizational health issue. And these, gaps get highlighted when you're starting to lead a change like transitioning to family-based care. So it's so important to be able to have access and support and recognize the organizational change challenges, organizational health challenges that will come up. I love that Jonathan said, this term transitional support is just such a limiting term. Really is just support, because it's not only emotional, psychological support for those leaders, the organizational support. Those things are so important. What's cool though is, as Phil brought up, this is personal for everybody that we worked with. And when it's personal, it's hard because they're deeply invested at so many different levels. And that disentangling work is so challenging for them and for a coach and everyone involved. But it's also really beautiful, because then what we see in that process is transformation of a human. It's not just about transitioning a model of care, it's about transformation of people. And that can be very rewarding as well as very, very challenging. So those are two huge kind of findings. I think one other one that I'll mention, I know I'm taking up a lot of time, but it's just exciting learning at this point. The importance of quickly making quality connections to technical support on the ground, and ensuring that linkages to care reform networks or local areas of support are made as soon as possible. With our events, we reach out to partners in those countries prior to deciding if someone can participate there, to know that when they get excited about transition, they have the ability to access technical support, because we can see people get excited and make decisions out of their exuberance, out of their excitement, that could lead to dangerous situations for children. So it's super important to do that. And the only other huge one I would mention is just how important it is to do stakeholder engagement. Do not skip this. Do not move to reintegration or rush reintegration. Engaging the board deeply, donors deeply, staff deeply, talking early and being really strategic and thoughtful in those conversations. It's not something we can breeze over, but if you do it well, it can really smooth out some of the bumps for the transition moving forward. So we're learning these things and a lot more. And my hope is that all of us continually share what we're learning, because I'm seeing like Hannah's head nod, Jonathan's head nod, and I know they have 5 other bullets that they could share, and hopefully we'll share about what we're learning, so that we all can do better at supporting these organizations in transition.
No, that's really good, Elli. This is just supposed to whet the appetite in terms of what's out there, right? And the reason we wanted to bring on not only, faith to action and how you guys are really spearheading some of this on the faith-based front, but also trying to get those referrals out, but also looking at who's doing this like direct on the ground, and that's why we wanted to tap into ACCI and Weza Care as well, because there's no way that we could cover all of this, in just one podcast. So I just want to encourage our listeners, check out the show notes. They are embedded in iTunes, Spotify, wherever you're listening, and of course at thinkorphan.com. Just because there's going to be a lot of follow-up opportunities that are either right for you or right for somebody that you know. And maybe that's one of these transition connection events, or maybe it's reaching out to one of the professionals on this call. But I really want to kind of continue on, not just on the lessons learned that Elli was just sharing, but looking at what are some of these processes even look like, So I'm going to come to Hannah here in a second. Hannah, what are some of the processes and equipping that are necessary to transition to family care? And, what role does ACCI play to support those transitions?
Oh, I could talk about that for way too long. I'm going to just nerd out for a minute on that. There's so much good work that's been done, collaboratively with everybody right here on this podcast, through the Transitioning Residential Care Working Group. That's part of the global platform. Around just building an awareness of all the different elements and components and phases. I think that was your phrase, actually, that you came up with, the phases of transition. Because like Elli was saying, so many people skip certain parts of it, or they might, think that reintegration is actually the sum total of transition. And that's, it's understandable. It's a very important part, but it's also very dangerous to think of it that way because of all the other things we've talked about. And so, that stakeholder engagement piece, like Elli was talking about, is so important. Everything that happens post-transition is important for keeping, the funding in the country for child welfare services where the governments don't have enough. And then I think one that also gets overlooked very often is that kind of middle stage between between engagement and the actual reintegration or implementation would be that preparing for change spot. And I get it, because that's the boring part. That's where you're looking at what you've talked about, Elli, when you talk about the organizational health. But you can't expect an organization that's been running with very loose structures, with very little knowledge of child protection, child development, to then fully go into a very completely different program. And so that's one of the areas where I think a lot of awareness has been raised through the more recent tools and collaborative efforts of this group, to bring an awareness around why do we need to look at policies and frameworks of the organization? Why do we need to look at those gaps? Why are those important? Why do we need to conduct risk assessments for the project? And I'm not talking about child protection risk assessments. I'm talking about the fact that somebody's coming in with an intervention, which is transition. So the fact that you're introducing transition to an institution is inherently a risk, because it's something new that you're doing. So even if it's because you want to get the kids out and it's better for them ultimately, you still have to kind of look at that very analytically to say, where could that actually cause more harm? And that's all embedded within the phases of transition tool that we've been working on together, and highlights the need for a very close look at those procedures before we can actually look at moving children.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I like how it's sometimes the boring part that is really the pieces of it that actually set up for success, or it's the hard part to kind of self-reflect and think about your policies and procedures. It's not necessarily what a lot of the people in nonprofit space anywhere in the world get into it for that purpose. They want to see impact, right? And so unfortunately, a lot of organizations around the world, especially in the global South, don't have the fundamental training and education or experience or resources funded to cover that kind of stuff, organizational design and HR planning and finance management and legal and policy frameworks. It's the piece that we around the world in the nonprofit space, we woefully underfund almost all the time. And that's because we want to see impact. And the reality is impact can't really come if we're not healthy holistically. And I think that's really important. I think the other thing, Elli, you said that's, I think, just so core to this, it's really about relationships. And transition is not necessarily a very technical thing. It's a relational thing. And I think what we've learned in the process we kind of follow as a guiding process overall is that when we were doing reintegration, what we learned was these families were broken not because of poverty or health or hygiene or other kinds of typical interventions. There's a broken relationship somewhere deep in there. And that most families are actually separated not because of, these external factors like poverty, but they're broken because of broken relationships. And if you run the math on it, you'll find that there's a lot of people in poverty that are in strong families. And so recognizing that the core is broken relationships, the goal then is to bring relational solutions, provide a social worker or counselor to show up on a regular basis in those families to help them restore those relationships. That's the key. And so as we started working through transition support services, what we're finding is the same is true. There's broken relationships between staff, relationships between management, between board, between the government officers and the donors. There's trust and distrust, and there's fear and shame. And that ultimately in these institutions, they're experiencing a lot of shame, especially because the way that care reform started in deinstitutionalization in Kenya was shut down or we'll close you down kind of attitude. They're rightfully afraid that someone's going to come in one day and pull the rug out from them. And so going in and being able to deal with the humanity of it and provide a relationship is what we do. We've got a team of, a Kenyan staff with a great experience in social work counseling and organizational management. And they show up every month on a regular basis to each organization. And it's a personal relationship is what we offer. And that personal relationship is there to help them walk the journey, knowing that each and every organization is unique and different. And we all have a map. BCN and ACCI and Faith Action have done an amazing job of really laying out all of the key frameworks and understandings that need to be understood in order to do transition. So now all we're doing is building on that by putting a person there with that information on a regular basis to help them figure out their particular journey. Each one takes a unique step, but we all got to go through all 4 phases. We all got to walk through the basic same journey, but I think the key is just putting a human being there who's trauma informed, who's focused on understanding that this is about relationships and equipping and reconciling relationships when they're broken between donors, between the government, between staff. And I think when we start there, the other processes like organizational design and finance planning and policy planning, they're actually not directly those activities. They're actually team building. They're about participatory approach. They're about getting the leaders equipped to build the capacity of their team and their relationships. And so when we look at it as a relational intervention, then the technical boring stuff kind of becomes a little bit more fun because it's about having fun together and learning together and growing together and learning how to make decisions together. And so that's, I think, what I've ultimately learned in the key process we focus on. So,
yeah, and I think the technical side of it, while it is critical, to this space, you really can't have it alone. It has to come hand in hand with that journeying. And I think everybody can speak to that because it's not really fair, honestly, to expect the average person to take these kinds of tools and say, hey, you go and work it out. We couldn't do it. It took us years to come up with this stuff and, 100 brains in the room. So how could we expect the average donor to do that? So I think that's where, the technical support orgs, for lack of a better term, I guess, is all the stuff that comes with it. So it's that coaching. It's the, when this happens, can I pick up the phone and call someone and say, what do? I don't have a manual for how to deal with this specific problem. And so that's, I think, a really integral part of all of the work that we're doing is that journey, that coaching. And I don't think it's actually very responsible to offer those kinds of tools and resources without that extra support.
Yeah. And on that note, can we just really quickly, we're going to have a last question where you guys are just going to be able to talk about first steps for people. But let's say people are looking for tools and resources that, as you said, I wouldn't encourage anyone to just go find a tool resource, read it and go, oh, there's the answers. You need to talk with people who have been through this, but can you give some even tools and resources of personal people and organizations and things like that people can go to, if they have questions, if they want to get some help in this area. So I don't know if you want to start with that, Elli, and just real quick, as we're wrapping up, just give some tools and resources that whether they're people, organizations, or actual things they can read to get an idea of the nuances of what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, I do want to give a shout out to the phases of transition interactive diagram that Hannah's been talking about. Even just that first glance, it's separated from preparation, or it's from, I think it's a learning, preparation, and implementation. It's just, when I work with organizations in those first initial conversations, it's just helpful to go, oh, there is a process here. People have been through it. I'm kind of giving a sense. I can kind of start to look and say, we have competency in these areas, but we don't have any competency in these areas. And so you kind of get a sense of where you're going to need help and support. So I think that's a super helpful. I mean, and the fact that many organizations came together and all provided their kind of their process that they journey people through. I asked for that like 9 years ago, and people were kind of like, "Oh, I'm not ready to share it because I'm not sure what's going to happen." But in this last few years, people have shared it and put it all out on the table because people know the demand is, I think someone had mentioned it, maybe Jonathan, is like, no one organization is going to be able to do this, and it's happening. So we've got to work together. So that consolidated knowledge is in the phases of transition interactive diagram. There's also case studies that I have found really exciting. We have, I think, maybe around 15 brand new case studies of organizations that have gone through a transition. And those are just great to read. You're not going to find one that's exactly what your organization is going through, but you're going to start to, like, it's all going to start to, the connection's going to happen when you really hear about what this has looked like for organizations. So both of those on Better Care Network's website, you can just Google case studies, or you can just Google phases of transition and it pops up. So that's great. When it comes to faith-based organization that's getting funding from the U.S. or has a headquartered U.S., Faith to Action, that is what we do. I fundraise my booty off so I can have people ready to pick up and talk to you on the phone. So we're here to help. All of our services are free because we want you to have access to best practices. And then there's hundreds of individuals and organizations out there, probably one in the very country that you are working or living in, that are a resource. And I want to name some off, but then I'll be showing like favorites, and I'm scared to do that. But 4 of them are in this podcast, and there's many more. So it's just a matter of making connections with people who are in your region, in your country, and also maybe have some of the same experiences you have. So we would love to be able to help you make those connections, as I'm sure the other guests would as well.
Yeah, and I think for that space particularly, I mean, Faith to Action is kind of it. You know, that's the entry point. When you want somebody to look at that, that's where you direct them to. And I think the case studies, especially that you're talking about, Elli, all of the Faith to Action case studies, those in some ways I feel are more important and helpful than the actual statistics or reports. And I don't know how many donors actually read the reports that I sent them 10 years ago, because they're very dry, aren't they? And they just need to be able to connect, like you said, with somebody who's gone before. They need to know that it's possible. And I love the term champions that you use, because when you look at the people who have actually gone through this, roll their sleeves up to get their hands dirty and go through it for 5 years and more, refinance their own homes to pay for it. I mean, they've really been through it. That connection and that story is going to be so much more powerful than any report or, technical practitioner talking to you about a tool. And so I don't think those can be underestimated. And those are, like Elli said, everywhere. And there's really been a push in the recent years to document more of those. And I think the video case studies are really impactful as well. So I think anything in that arena is really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think I can only promote the tools that I go to. And when I have a question, I go to BCN, I go to Faith to Action, I look for ACCI. And I think that's good. I think the other tool or resource is just recognizing the strength you have within your own organization. I think you got to start, we just ask questions. Just get really good at
how positive you are, Jonathan. I have to say, I need a little more dose of you in my cynical life.
Good for you, Gordon.
Maybe I'm on the other side. I've been through such hard times and struggles with all this, and coming out on the other side and recognizing that, yes, even though all of that is there, this is hard stuff with hard cases and bad situations have happened, and then coming out on the other side and recognizing that there's also something really beautiful here. And this space is so new still. If you think about the case studies and the tools and the resources, we know very little about transition. If only 1,500 organizations have been transitioned in the world, according to this, with this study, then we have a long way to go. And the best people who are going to come up with the best answers are on the ground now with what they know and what they have in front of them as their only guide. And so you can go to BCN, go to Faith to Action, go to ACCI, go to One Main Home. Like, great resources are emerging, but more is to be discovered. And the best people to discover it are those on the ground. Organization that transitioned themselves here in Kenya, the director just asked great questions. Talk to your kids, talk to your staff, talk to your donors, talk to your community members, just ask questions. And I think that's what will be a real guide, because the answers can't really be found so much, on a website. They're found on the ground. And the website and all those things are great because they'll really help you when you get to those, how do I solve this problem thing? But if we aren't asking great questions in the first place, then we really don't, it's like a car without a steering wheel. So I think ask great questions. Stakeholder engagement, Elli, you said it, that's number one. If you don't do that, you have nothing else to do.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Thank you all. I think it's good to be aware of those. And I mean, it takes both. I think, even looking at the case studies or some of the free resources that are out there, I would just even plug, Journey Home, and the trainings that are on there. And hopefully even Think Orphan. I mean, hopefully what we're saying is there are things out there to kind of, again, whet the appetite, help you envision that transition is possible. Use those resources, use some of these guidelines or, these kind of roadmaps that are out there, and then plug in with somebody. It doesn't have to be, it's complicated, it's nuanced, but it isn't brain surgery necessarily. You just have to tap into the right people and be able to envision that transition is possible. So just really appreciate each of you guys kind of highlighting that. All right, we got one last final kind of rapid fire question. So Elli, no long answers this time for crying out loud. No, I'm just joking. 60 seconds or less. All right. So if someone is listening to this show, maybe, and to be honest, I have to be honest. I mean, especially over the last 2.5 years, I talk so much about care reform on this show. Who knows if we still have orphanages listening, or hopefully orphanages that have transitioned, but maybe it's been passed along. If someone is listening to this show and they are running an orphanage, but have interest in transitioning to family care, in 60 seconds or less, what would be your advice to them in terms of taking a first step? I'm going to go to Jonathan first.
I write down 5 names of people that you can go and talk to about this. Closer you can get to the ground, the better, but just start asking questions. Be a discoverer, be a pioneer. No one has all the answers. So we have to find them.
Yeah, it's good. Hannah, how would you respond?
Very similar. Connect to somebody, ask for help. You're not in this alone, like Elli was saying. Just know up front that it's a huge job, and chances are that it's going to get pretty complicated before things get better. But you're not alone. And there's so many of us that have been working in this space for so long who will just be thrilled that you're here and asking those questions. So we're all here to help you. There's so much that has happened before, and we can all learn from it together. Ask for help. You're not alone.
That's good. All right, Elli.
Goodness, you guys already took mine. I would just say in this community, let's be honest and vulnerable with one another. This is a space of learning. None of us have the answers. It is not us versus them. We are all in desperate need of honest dialogue. Mm-hmm. And so just invite you to bring your questions and bring them humbly, and bring your solutions too. And we're all going to be better for it.
Well, that is a good sentiment to end on, and that learning posture, especially for us. I mean, this is a faith-based organization. If we aren't on a discipleship track, even when it comes to how we provide child welfare services, then I don't know what we're doing. We need to be applying that coming alongside other people, always be humble, always try to learn as much as possible. And I think that if those are our approaches and kind of how we step into this, I think God's going to be faithful to meet us in that space. So Hannah, Elli, Jonathan, thank you each so much for coming onto the show. I'm going to throw it back to Phil to close this out.
Yeah, I too just want to thank you guys. And I would say add this to the mix of this episode, I think is a great resource for people that are thinking about this and just having questions about it. Because I think the conversation today was so grace-filled. And that's something that I think it models what we need in this, right? It's just a grace-filled conversation to have that posture of humility, that posture of learning. And that's what I felt was here even as we're talking about this. It's not saying here's the best thing to go look at and that will give all your answers. No, we're learning all this stuff and we will continually be learning all of this stuff because we're learning new things that then require new questions, which require new ideas. And then it gets us out of our comfort zone. I just did a training yesterday on the fact that most of the best things in life happen just on the other side of our comfort zone. And we need to be there and we need to meet people there and we need to push people to get there. And I think that this conversation today has done that. I know for me, even as I'm learning things and I'm wrestling with different things. So the more you do this, the more you realize there's a lot more questions than answers that we have. And some people have the answers. And if we can find each other, that's the great thing that we can do here. So with that, folks, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I do encourage you to wrestle with these things and to really be challenging yourself to think deeper, to challenge others to think deeper, and to really seek those answers together and work together to find solutions for these really important issues in our world today. And with that, I hope that pray that you're taking everything you're learning from this show and you're using it to help you to love orphan and vulnerable children and families better and better each and every day. Thanks a lot. Have a great couple weeks.
We hope you've enjoyed today's Think Orphan podcast. For all the information in this week's podcast, please visit us at thinkorphan.com. You too can be part of the conversation. Send your questions to info@thinkorphan.com or join us on the Think Orphan Facebook page. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again on the next edition of Think Orphan.